Everyone's seen a tank gun, but almost no one has actually understood what made one of the strangest, most awkward-looking anti-tank weapons in British military history one of the most effective killing machines of the 20th century. For years, it was dismissed, laughed at by allies, questioned by generals, called clumsy, oversized, and obsolete almost before it even reached the battlefield. And yet, decade after decade, it kept showing up. It kept punching through armor. It kept destroying tanks that were supposed to be far beyond its capability. And the last time it was used in serious combat, the gun was over 40 years old. If that sounds impossible, it's because most people have never actually looked at this weapon closely. Not just the design, not just the specs, but the full story, where it came from, what problems it was trying to solve, why the British military almost gave up on it, and why, despite everything working against it, it outlasted nearly every competitor that tried to replace it. What you're about to hear is the real story of the British 17-pounder anti-tank gun. Not the sanitized version, not the version that only covers World War II, the full picture. From the desperate early days of the North African campaign, through the hedgerows of Normandy, into the cold calculations of the Cold War, and all the way to conflicts in the Middle East, where this weapon was still being loaded, aimed, and fired at real tanks, decades after everyone assumed it had been retired. If you've ever wondered how a gun designed in the 1940s could still be relevant in the 1980s, stick with us, because the answer involves more than engineering. It involves the entire philosophy of how Britain thought about tank warfare, armor penetration, and what it actually means to build something that lasts. And if this is the kind of deep history you want more of, hit subscribe right now. There's a lot more where this is coming from. Let's go back to the beginning. And to understand where the 17-pounder came from, you need to understand just how badly things were going for Britain in the early years of the Second World War. By 1941, the war in the Western Desert was revealing something deeply uncomfortable about British anti-tank capability. The standard British anti-tank gun at the time was the 2-pounder. It was a fine weapon when it was designed, compact, fast to deploy, accurate at reasonable ranges. But the German Afrika Korps had moved on. Rommel's tanks, and more specifically, the German tank doctrine, were evolving faster than British planners had anticipated. The 2-pounder was losing its edge. Against early German armor, it had been adequate. Against the newer marks of German tanks, particularly those with thicker frontal armor, it was increasingly inadequate. The shots were bouncing, the shells weren't penetrating where they needed to, and British tank crews and anti-tank gun crews were paying the price in lives. The 6-pounder was already in development, and it would prove to be a significant improvement. But even before the 6-pounder had finished its development trials, British planners were already thinking ahead, because the pattern was clear. German tanks were going to keep getting heavier. The armor was going to keep getting thicker, and any gun that was adequate today would probably be inadequate in 2 years. So in 1941, while the war was still very much in the balance, the British began working on something much more powerful. The requirement was brutal in its simplicity. They needed a gun that could defeat any tank the Germans were likely to field. Not just current tanks, but future tanks. The kind of tanks that hadn't been built yet, but were almost certainly coming. They wanted penetration capability that left a significant margin for growth, and they wanted it as soon as possible. What they came up with was a weapon that would fire a 17-pound projectile, hence the name, at a velocity high enough to punch through armor that no current British weapon could touch. The caliber settled on was 76.2 millimeters, roughly 3 inches in bore diameter, and when the specifications were worked out, the numbers were impressive. At combat ranges of around 500 to 1,000 yards, it could punch through armor that would stop nearly anything else the Allies had. The problem was everything else about it. The 17-pounder was not a compact weapon. It was not elegant. It was not easy to handle, easy to move, or easy to conceal. The gun itself was nearly 19 feet long, with the barrel extended. The whole carriage assembly was heavy, awkward, and required a well-trained crew to get into and out of action quickly. The breech mechanism, while functional, required careful handling. The ammunition was large, heavy, and somewhat unwieldy for the gun crew to manage in the field. Loading the weapon under fire, in a cramped position, with tired men, required practice and discipline that not every unit could guarantee. And when you first look at a photograph of the 17-pounder in its towed field configuration, sitting on its split-trail carriage, with those oversized wheels and that enormous barrel dominating the frame, you immediately understand why it developed the reputation it did. It looked like something from another era, not sleek and modern like the German 88, not low and menacing, just big, visually clumsy, like a weapon that had been scaled up faster than the rest of its design could keep pace with. But here's the thing about weapons. Looks are not the point. Penetration is the point. And what the 17-pounder could do to enemy armor was something that erased every aesthetic complaint almost immediately. The gun began to reach operational units in early 1943. Its introduction was not without controversy and not without difficulty. The initial carriages had problems. The gun was so powerful that the recoil forces were punishing, and the early mounts struggled to handle them reliably under repeated fire. There were issues with the split-trail design in certain terrains. The weapon was harder to maneuver in confined spaces than the 6-pounder it was partly intended to supplement. And yet none of that mattered when the first proper tests against captured German armor were carried out, because the results were simply extraordinary for the era. At ranges where other British guns were bouncing shells off the front glacis of German tanks, the 17-pounder was punching clean through. The penetration data that came back from firing trials was enough to quiet most of the critics, at least temporarily. The deployment of the 17-pounder in North Africa came almost too late to influence the final stages of that campaign. But it arrived in force for the Italian campaign and was ready in significant numbers for what everyone knew was coming: the invasion of Northwest Europe, Normandy. And it was in the Bocage country of France that the 17-pounder truly began to build its legend, because 1944 changed everything about what tank warfare meant. June 6, 1944, D-Day, opened the campaign in Northwest Europe, and within days, Allied armored forces were discovering a terrifying truth about the German tank force they were now fighting directly. The Tigers were real, the Panthers were real, and the standard Sherman tank that equipped most Allied armored divisions was utterly outclassed by both. The Sherman was reliable. It was mechanically sound. It was available in enormous numbers thanks to American industrial output. But its gun, the 75mm fitted to most marks, simply could not reliably penetrate a Tiger from the front at normal combat ranges. Against a Panther, the situation was nearly as bad, and the Sherman's armor, designed to a standard that was already being exceeded, was being penetrated by German anti-tank guns and tank guns with depressing regularity. Allied tank crews began calling the Sherman the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter brand whose advertising slogan was "Lights first time, every time." Because that's what Shermans seemed to do when hit. They burned. First time. Every time. The nickname was gallows humor of the darkest kind, born from the experience of watching fellow tankers die inside vehicles that were supposed to be competitive. The British and Canadian forces had partial solutions. The Firefly was one of them, and it's here that the 17-pounder becomes genuinely revolutionary. The Sherman Firefly was, in its essence, a standard American Sherman tank hull, fitted with a modified 17-pounder gun instead of the original American armament. The installation required significant engineering work. The gun was too long and too powerful for a straightforward fit. The breech had to be rotated 90 degrees to fit within the turret. The radio was moved out of the turret and into an armored box on the rear hull. The loader's position was reconfigured. The entire installation was a compromise in several respects. But when it worked, it transformed the Sherman from a vehicle that struggled against German heavy armor into something that could fight back. The Firefly was the only tank in the Allied inventory in Normandy that could reliably knock out a Tiger from the front at battle ranges. Not close ranges, not from flanking positions, from the front, at ranges where a Tiger crew felt relatively confident. The 17-pounder changed that calculation entirely. The Germans noticed immediately. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations from the Normandy campaign confirmed that German tank crews were specifically briefed to identify and priority target the Firefly in any Allied tank formation. The giveaway was the longer barrel and the counterweight added to the end of the gun to manage the balance after the modification. German crews were told to take out the Firefly first because it was the one vehicle that genuinely threatened them. That fact alone tells you everything about how seriously the 17-pounder was taken by the people on the receiving end of it. In the hedgerow country of Normandy, the 17-pounder in its various forms became the backbone of British and Commonwealth anti-armor capability. Towed versions deployed by Royal Artillery anti-tank regiments set up carefully prepared positions along likely avenues of approach, waiting for German armor to come to them. Fireflies worked within Sherman squadrons, typically 1 Firefly to 3 standard Shermans, providing the armor-killing punch the regular tanks lacked. The tactical picture was often brutal. Anti-tank guns in static positions faced the terrifying prospect of being found and attacked before they could engage effectively. The 17-pounder's weight made quick displacement difficult. If a position was identified and mortared, or hit with direct fire before the gun crew could move, the result was catastrophic. Crews were lost, guns were destroyed, and the process of getting a new gun into action in a new position under those conditions was not fast. But the gun crews adapted. They learned camouflage discipline at a level that verged on obsessive. They pre-surveyed alternative positions. They studied the terrain with the eye of men who understood that their survival depended on not being seen until the moment they chose to fire. And when they did choose to fire, the results vindicated everything. There are accounts from Normandy of 17-pounder crews engaging Tigers at ranges that made German crews believe they were beyond any threat, only to watch the shot hit home and the tank brew up. The psychological effect on German crews of discovering that the weapon they thought couldn't reach them actually could was significant. It disrupted the confidence that Tiger crews in particular had developed regarding their own near invulnerability when handled correctly. By the time the Allied armies broke out from Normandy and began the pursuit toward Germany, the 17-pounder had established itself as one of the finest anti-tank weapons in the war. It wasn't perfect. It was still heavy and awkward. The Firefly installation was still a compromise. But the penetration performance was simply better than almost anything else the Allies had in the field in comparable numbers. And the gun story was nowhere near finished. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the calculation that drives every military procurement decision shifted. The next threat was no longer Germany. The next threat, for British planners, was the Soviet Union. And the question that military designers had to answer was simple but demanding. What was the Soviet Union going to field on a future European battlefield? What did British anti-tank capability need to look like to handle that threat? The answer, at least initially, was the 17-pounder. Because despite its wartime reputation for awkwardness, and despite the fact that newer weapon concepts were being explored, the 17-pounder's performance data was still extremely competitive against the armor figures that intelligence assessments attributed to early Soviet tank designs. The T-34, the core of Soviet armored power in the late 1940s, was a tank the 17-pounder could handle effectively. Later Soviet tank designs like the T-54 presented a more demanding challenge, but the 17-pounder's penetration characteristics, particularly when combined with improved ammunition types developed in the post-war period, kept it relevant for longer than most people today realize. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it speaks to one of the 17-pounder's most underappreciated qualities. The gun was not a static design. The projectile technology that fed into it continued to develop after the war ended. And as that technology evolved, the gun's effective capability against armor grew in ways that the original designers couldn't have fully anticipated. Armor-piercing ammunition had gone through several distinct generations during the war itself. The basic armor-piercing round, the one that simply relied on kinetic energy from a hard steel projectile, had been supplemented and in many applications superseded by more sophisticated types. Armor-piercing capped rounds used a softer cap over the hard penetrator to prevent the shot from deflecting on sloped armor. Armor-piercing capped ballistic cap rounds added a second cap for better aerodynamics, while keeping the armor-defeating properties of the first cap. These were improvements, but they were still fundamentally kinetic energy rounds working on the same basic physical principle. The post-war development of discarding sabot ammunition changed the equation more fundamentally. A sabot round fired a smaller, denser penetrator inside a larger bore by using a lightweight carrier, the sabot, that fell away after leaving the muzzle. Because the penetrating core was smaller and denser, while still being propelled by the full energy of the large powder charge, it reached much higher velocities than a conventional round of the same caliber. Higher velocity meant more kinetic energy. More kinetic energy meant more penetration against modern armor. When discarding sabot ammunition was developed for the 17-pounder, the gun's penetration performance improved significantly over its already impressive wartime baseline. The tests conducted in the late 1940s and into the 1950s showed that a 17-pounder firing APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot, was capable of defeating armor plate that would have stopped even a wartime 17-pounder firing older ammunition. The gun had effectively grown more powerful, without changing its fundamental design, simply because the ammunition had improved. This is one of the key factors in understanding how the 17-pounder managed to remain relevant for so much longer than its clumsy wartime reputation would suggest. The gun was a platform, and like any good platform, it could be updated, refined, and improved as the technology around it evolved. The Centurion tank changed the picture significantly for British armored forces. When the Centurion entered service, it brought with it the 84mm 20-pounder gun, a direct descendant of and improvement over the 17-pounder concept, but more powerful and better suited to the new turret designs. The Centurion became the backbone of British armored capability in the 1950s and beyond, and its own gun brought penetration performance that went beyond what even the improved 17-pounder could manage. But the 17-pounder did not simply disappear from service, because Britain was not the only country using it. The 17-pounder had been supplied to Commonwealth nations and Allied forces during and after the war. Countries that received this weapon included Canada, Australia, India, and several others. Some of these nations retained the weapon in service because replacing it required a capital investment they either couldn't afford or didn't immediately prioritize. The 17-pounder represented a significant capability even if it was no longer the absolute cutting edge. And for nations that didn't face an immediate high-intensity tank threat, keeping a proven, understood weapon in service made more sense than rushing to replace it with something newer that might require extensive training and infrastructure support. In the Middle East, the story took a particularly interesting turn. Israel, which was fighting for its survival almost from the moment of its founding in 1948, acquired various weapons from whatever sources it could access. British surplus weapons, including the 17-pounder, made their way into Israeli service. And in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israeli forces operated under conditions where every piece of functional hardware was precious. The 17-pounder's anti-armor capability was not something any sensible military commander would voluntarily surrender when the alternative was a tank threat that the gun could still address. But it was in later Israeli conflicts that the 17-pounder's durability became most dramatically apparent, because by the time the 1956 Suez Crisis came around, the Arab states that Israel faced were equipped with Soviet armor, T-34s, and later, as the Cold War arms race pumped hardware into the region, increasingly modern Soviet tanks began appearing in Egyptian and Syrian inventories. Against the T-34, the 17-pounder remained effective. This wasn't a surprising finding. The T-34 was a wartime design, and the 17-pounder had been built with exactly the intention of defeating wartime German armor that was comparable. What was more remarkable was the extent to which, with APD's ammunition, the 17-pounder's performance could be pushed against even some later armor. Israel's situation drove creative solutions. Israeli engineers and ordnance specialists were not passive recipients of inherited British technology. They looked at the weapons they had and asked how to make them better. Ammunition was tested and optimized. Some weapons were modified. The IDF developed a culture of making whatever was available work harder than it was supposed to, partly out of necessity and partly out of a genuine engineering culture that found satisfaction in solving the problem in front of them, rather than waiting for an ideal solution that might never arrive. The 17-pounder in Israeli service through the 1950s represents one of the cleaner examples of how a weapon can stay viable well beyond its intended service life when it's in the hands of people who understand both the weapon's limits and how to work around them tactically. Now we need to talk about the Archer, because the 17-pounder was not only a towed gun or a tank gun, it was also mounted in one of the most unusual armored vehicles ever produced by a major military power. And the Archer is central to understanding how the 17-pounder's operational story continued into the post-war decades. The Archer tank destroyer was built on the hull of the Valentine tank, which was already considered somewhat obsolete by the time the Archer was designed. The installation of the 17-pounder on this hull required a compromise that looks, on paper, almost absurd. The gun pointed backward, not to the rear, as in a reversal of the vehicle's direction of movement, but literally mounted so that when the vehicle drove forward, in the conventional sense, the gun barrel pointed over the engine deck toward the rear. To engage a target, the driver had to reverse the vehicle toward the enemy, or the vehicle would drive forward, stop, and the gun would engage from a position where the hull faced away from the target. This arrangement sounds like the product of either desperation or madness. In practice, it was neither. It was a solution to a specific engineering problem. The Valentine hull was too small and too lightly built to accept a 17-pounder in a conventional forward-facing turreted or casement installation, without either a complete redesign of the hull, which would take too long, or a reduction in armor protection to save weight, which was undesirable. The rearward-facing installation allowed the gun to be fitted on the available hull, with the long barrel overhanging the engine compartment in a way that could actually be managed structurally. More practically, the arrangement had an accidental tactical benefit. After firing, the Archer could drive away from its firing position without needing to turn around. This sounds minor until you think about what anti-tank gun tactics actually require. Survival for a self-propelled or towed anti-tank weapon depends heavily on mobility after the shot. An enemy tank that identifies where the shot came from immediately begins the process of returning fire or maneuvering against the anti-tank weapon. The faster the weapon can move to a new position, the harder it is to engage. The Archer could fire and immediately accelerate away because the driver was already facing the direction of retreat. The Archer saw action in the Northwest European campaign, in the last phases of the Second World War. It also served in the Middle East, and like other platforms carrying the 17-pounder, it ended up in post-war service with a number of countries that couldn't immediately afford or access more modern equivalents. Egypt received Archers, and those vehicles were still in Egyptian inventory when the 1956 Suez Crisis began. British and French forces, combined with Israeli forces in a coordinated but publicly denied operation, engaged Egyptian military forces that included the very weapon that British engineers had designed and built over a decade earlier. There is something almost surreal about that situation. A British weapon fighting against a British military operation, not because of any ideological twist, simply because surplus military hardware flows across borders in ways that don't respect the politics of later decades. The Egyptian Archers and 17-pounders in the 1956 conflict were matched against armor and infantry that were considerably better equipped and better trained than the forces facing them in many cases. The outcomes were predictable in the sense that Egyptian forces, facing professional military operations from 3 directions simultaneously, were overwhelmed. But the 17-pounder's performance in that conflict again validated the underlying weapon, even as the strategic and political situation around it was chaotic. Now let's think about what was happening in anti-tank technology more broadly through the 1950s and 1960s, because it provides the context for understanding why the 17-pounder's survival was so remarkable. Anti-tank guided missiles were entering service in significant numbers by the early 1960s, the SS-10 in French, and then wider Western service, the Vigilant in British service, the Swingfire that would follow later. These missiles changed the fundamental calculus of anti-tank warfare. A man-portable or vehicle-mounted missile system could engage tanks at ranges far beyond what any conventional gun of manageable size could achieve. The penetration achieved by a shaped charge warhead was not dependent on the velocity of the projectile, which meant that even a relatively light vehicle or an infantryman could carry something that would defeat heavy armor. At the same time, the main battle tank concept was maturing. The Centurion had shown that a single tank could combine firepower, mobility, and protection in ways that specialized tank destroyer designs like the Archer couldn't match. The dominant British philosophy shifted toward the main battle tank and away from dedicated anti-tank platforms. The Chieftain, which would enter service in the mid-1960s, took this philosophy to its logical conclusion with armor protection that was exceptional by contemporary standards and a 120mm rifled gun that represented a generational leap over the 17-pounder. Against this backdrop, the 17-pounder should have been thoroughly irrelevant by the mid-1960s. In British service, it essentially was. The Royal Artillery had moved on. The Royal Armoured Corps had moved on. The weapon was surplus history. But here is where the story takes the turn that makes it genuinely extraordinary. The Middle East, in the 1960s, was a powder keg. The Arab-Israeli dispute had not been resolved by the 1948 war or the 1956 crisis. The states surrounding Israel were receiving increasing quantities of Soviet military equipment. The T-54 and T-55, which were the primary Soviet tank exports of the period, were serious weapons by any standard, well armored for their era, fitted with a capable 100mm gun, available in large numbers, and operated by crews who were receiving training that improved over time. Israel faced these tanks with a mix of equipment: Centurions acquired from Britain, M48 patents from the United States, in some cases through somewhat indirect channels, Sherman variants modified and upgraded to keep them useful, and older equipment that remained in inventory because replacing everything immediately was not economically possible. What happened in 1967 changed the entire conversation. The Six-Day War of June 1967 was one of the most rapid and decisive conventional military victories in modern history. Israeli forces destroyed or captured the air forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in the opening hours and spent the next 5.5 days systematically defeating the ground forces of all three nations. The tank engagements were intense, numerous, and analyzed in extraordinary detail by military professionals around the world in the years that followed. And in those engagements, among the many weapons that performed in ways that either met or exceeded expectations, the 17-pounder made appearances that would have seemed implausible to anyone who had written it off years earlier. Modified Sherman tanks carrying 17-pounders were in Israeli service in 1967. The Israelis had taken the basic Sherman hull, already long in the tooth by any standard, and continued to upgrade and adapt it in ways that wrung performance out of a design that had been considered obsolete for years. Some of these Shermans carried the original 75mm gun in various upgraded forms. Others had been fitted with 17-pounders, or the French 75mm CN 7550 gun. The Israeli approach to the Sherman is worth understanding in its own right, because it represents a philosophy of pragmatic military capability that has few parallels. The Israeli Sherman variants in 1967 were not expected to fight on equal terms with T-54s and T-55s. The tactical doctrine understood their limitations. They were used in roles and at ranges that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing their exposure to conditions where their armor deficiencies would prove fatal. In the hands of experienced crews using good tactics, the 17-pounder equipped Sherman could find angles and ranges at which it could defeat T-55 armor, not from the front at standard engagement ranges, but from flanking positions at specific ranges where the geometry of the shot and the penetration capability of the gun combined to produce a result that the raw specification numbers might have suggested was impossible. The 1967 war generated vast amounts of technical and tactical data that was studied intensively. The performance of various Israeli weapons against Soviet-supplied Arab armor was analyzed with the kind of detail that only actual combat can provide, and the findings about older weapons, including the 17-pounder, contributed to decisions about how long to keep certain platforms operational. The 1973 Yom Kippur War was an entirely different experience. Egypt and Syria launched simultaneous surprise attacks that initially overwhelmed Israeli defenses through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The anti-tank missile was used on a scale and with an effectiveness that shocked Israeli planners. Soviet-supplied Sagar missiles in Egyptian hands destroyed large numbers of Israeli tanks in the opening phases of the war, and the experience fundamentally reshaped thinking about combined arms warfare and the vulnerability of tanks to infantry anti-tank weapons. In that conflict, the weight of Israeli armored response depended primarily on Centurions and M48-M60 series tanks, but the war also illustrated how fluid the situation was. Reserve units, many of them equipped with older weapons and vehicles, were thrown into action under emergency conditions. In those circumstances, whatever worked was used. The 17-pounder's presence in reserve inventory, as part of the mix of equipment that could be mobilized rapidly in a national emergency, meant it was potentially part of that picture even in 1973. But the most remarkable chapter in the 17-pounder's post-war story doesn't involve Israel. It involves a conflict that most people in Britain remember for entirely different reasons. Lebanon, in the early 1980s, was one of the most complex and violent environments in the world. The Lebanese civil war had been running since 1975. Palestinian militant organizations were operating from Lebanese territory. Syria had intervened militarily. Israel had conducted the 1978 Operation Litani to push PLO forces back from the border region. And in 1982, Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee, the full-scale invasion of Lebanon that would ultimately lead to a prolonged and controversial occupation of southern Lebanon and the disastrous siege of Beirut. In that conflict, various factions were operating with weapons from every imaginable source. Lebanese army units, Palestinian groups, Syrian-backed militias, Druze militias, Maronite Christian militias. Each faction had whatever it could acquire, and the acquisition chain ran through every arms market in the world. Syrian forces in Lebanon included T-55 and T-62 tanks. The T-62 was a significant upgrade over the T-55, with a 115mm smoothbore gun and improved armor. The Israeli forces deployed Centurions in their upgraded Shot form, M48s in their Magat configuration, and Merkava tanks, the first major deployment of Israel's domestically designed main battle tank. And in the hands of various forces in that incredibly confused battle space, older weapons continued to be used. The 17-pounder, in its various configurations, including the Archer self-propelled mounting that some sources indicate remained in Lebanese army inventory during this period, was still a functional weapon system in 1982. The Lebanese army was an entity that had been severely weakened by years of civil war, faction fighting, and desertion. But remnants of its equipment inventory reflected decades of acquisition from British and other sources, and British surplus weapons, including vehicles mounting 17-pounders, had made their way into Lebanese hands years before. Whether firing directly in anger in the confused battles of 1982, or present as part of the general inventory of a fragmented military trying to function under impossible conditions, the 17-pounder's presence in that conflict, over 40 years after its design was finalized, is one of the most extraordinary continuity stories in modern weapons history. 40 years. From the Western Desert in 1942 to the Bekaa Valley in 1982. From Normandy's hedgerows to Beirut's rubble. That is not a career that happens by accident. It happens because of specific decisions made at specific moments, and because of qualities in the original design that proved more durable than the critics had any reason to expect. Let's break down exactly why the 17-pounder lasted as long as it did, because there are several distinct factors, and each one tells you something important about weapons design, military procurement, and the economics of national defense. The first factor is the fundamental soundness of the caliber choice. 76.2 millimeters was not an arbitrary number. It represented a caliber large enough to carry a substantial propellant charge behind a projectile of meaningful weight, while remaining manageable in terms of the overall weapon dimensions and the physical demands on the crew. The bore was large enough that it could accommodate improved projectile designs as technology developed. When discarding sabot technology matured, the 76.2mm bore could work with the new ammunition in ways that genuinely enhanced the weapon's capability rather than simply maintaining it. A smaller caliber gun, one that might have been lighter and easier to handle, would have had less room to benefit from the new ammunition technology. The 17-pounder's relatively large bore turned out to be a form of future-proofing that wasn't fully understood at the time of design. The second factor is the quality of the basic engineering. For all its reputation for awkwardness, the 17-pounder was mechanically robust. It didn't break down easily. It was not a delicate instrument. It could be operated in the mud, dust, heat, and cold that characterize real military operations, and it kept working. Any weapon that aspires to long service life needs this quality above almost anything else. The finest performance figures mean nothing if the weapon is in the repair shop rather than in position when it's needed. The 17-pounder's durability meant that armies with limited maintenance infrastructure could keep it operational without the intensive support requirements that more complex systems demanded. The third factor is the economics of replacement. Replacing a weapon system is expensive. It's not just the cost of the new weapon itself. It's the cost of training new crews, establishing new supply chains for ammunition and spare parts, writing new doctrine, updating manuals, and all of the organizational overhead that comes with introducing a new system. For smaller or less wealthy military establishments, this cost is prohibitive. If the weapon you have is still doing its job adequately, the argument for keeping it in service, rather than replacing it, is economically compelling, even when a better option theoretically exists. The 17-pounder, precisely because it worked reliably and was understood by the people operating it, kept passing this test for decades in a series of military contexts where resources were constrained. The fourth factor is the tactical adaptability that the gun's performance envelope permitted. The 17-pounder was not a one-trick weapon. It could be used in a towed field configuration for ambush and defensive operations. It could be mounted in tanks, as with the Firefly. It could be mounted in self-propelled vehicles, as with the Archer. This flexibility meant that forces using it could adapt their doctrine to their specific circumstances rather than being locked into one operational pattern. The weapon fit multiple tactical concepts, which extended its utility across a wider range of military contexts than a more specialized design might have managed. The fifth, and perhaps most underappreciated factor, is the ammunition development that continued long after the weapon's design was finalized. The 17-pounder was not just the gun. It was a gun plus an evolving family of projectiles, each generation more capable than the last. The move from basic armor-piercing to capped rounds to discarding sabot represented genuine performance improvement. And because the gun's bore and chamber dimensions could accommodate these developments, the weapon's effective capability against armor grew over time rather than stagnating. This is the single biggest reason the gun remained relevant against tank threats that had been developed decades after its own design was completed. It's worth spending a moment on the APD's development in particular, because it represents one of the most important technical advances in conventional anti-armor ammunition of the 20th century. The principle behind discarding sabot is elegant in its simplicity. You want a projectile that is very dense, very hard, and very fast. Dense and hard, so that when it reaches the target, it punches through, rather than shattering against the armor. Fast, because kinetic energy increases with the square of velocity, so even modest velocity increases produce large penetration gains. The problem is that high density typically means high mass, and high mass makes it harder to achieve high velocity with a given propellant charge. The sabot solution separates the propulsion problem from the penetration problem. The sabotage is light and fits the full bore of the gun, so the propellant charge accelerates the whole assembly efficiently. But the heavy, small-diameter penetrating core inside the sabotage carries most of the kinetic energy. When the assembly leaves the muzzle, the sabotage petals split away and fall clear, leaving the small, dense penetrator flying at a velocity that a projectile of that core's mass alone could never have achieved. For the 17-pounder, APD's ammunition transformed the penetration figures in a way that extended service life dramatically. The gun that had been impressive, but not exceptional, in 1944, became significantly more capable in 1950 firing APDs than it had been 5 years earlier firing standard AP. And that gap, between the 1944 baseline and the 1950 with APD's performance, is a big part of the story of how the weapon remained relevant into the Cold War era. There is also the specific context of Cold War proxy conflicts and arms transfers that needs to be understood. The global arms trade during the Cold War was not driven purely by military logic. It was driven by political alignment, by hard currency needs, by alliance obligations, and by the simple practical reality that military surplus from the major powers flowed constantly into the hands of smaller states. Britain, like the United States and the Soviet Union, moved large quantities of surplus military equipment to aligned or potentially aligned states through the 1950s and 1960s. That equipment included not just small arms and artillery, but anti-tank guns, self-propelled guns, armored vehicles, and all the associated ammunition and spare parts infrastructure. Once a weapon enters this stream of international arms transfers, it develops a persistence that is almost impossible to track precisely. A weapon sold to one country is sometimes resold or transferred to a third country. Captured weapons are pressed into service by the capturing forts. Weapons in storage for decades are reactivated when a new threat emerges and replacement hardware isn't immediately available. The 17-pounder participated in this process extensively, and tracing every instance of its operational use in conflicts around the world between 1950 and 1985 would require archival research of extraordinary scope. What we can say with confidence is that the weapon appeared in operational inventories and potentially in combat in the Middle East, in South and Southeast Asia, in parts of Africa, and in the broader Commonwealth world throughout the decades after World War II. Each appearance represents a small chapter in a story that stretched far beyond the Western European theater, where most people's imagination of the weapon begins and ends. The legacy of the 17-pounder also needs to be considered in terms of the design lineage it spawned. The gun was not a dead end. It was part of a continuous British development effort in anti-tank gun design that moved from the 2-pounder to the 6-pounder to the 17-pounder and then to the 20-pounder fitted in the Centurion. Each step in that progression learned from the previous one. The challenges of fitting the 17-pounder in the Firefly directly informed how the 20-pounder was designed to integrate with new turret designs. The recoil management lessons learned from the 17-pounder's punishing forces fed into the engineering of subsequent weapons. In this sense, the 17-pounder's influence extended even beyond its own operational life. It shaped the thinking of the engineers and planners who came after it. The gun was a learning experience on a grand scale, and the knowledge derived from it contributed directly to the development of the Centurion's main armament and, through that lineage, to the L11 and L30 120mm guns that eventually equipped the Challenger family of tanks. The broader lesson the 17-pounder teaches about weapons development is one that defense planners have consistently struggled to apply. The temptation is always to chase the current threat, to optimize for the enemy that exists today rather than the enemy that will exist in 3 years or 5 years. The 17-pounder's designers, working in the desperate circumstances of 1941, made a different choice. They overshot the immediate requirement deliberately, building in penetration capability that significantly exceeded what was needed against current German armor in hopes that the margin would cover the next generation of German tanks. It did, and then some. That philosophy of designing ahead of the current threat is the fundamental reason the 17-pounder remained viable for as long as it did. The gun was not just adequate when it entered service. It was generous. It had margin. And margin, in weapons design as in engineering generally, is what separates a solution that works for a decade from one that works for 4. Compare this to the 2-pounder, which the 17-pounder was partly created to supplement. The 2-pounder had been a perfectly adequate weapon when it entered service. Against the tanks it was designed to fight, it performed well, but it had been designed precisely for the current threat, with little margin against the armor developments that everyone should have been able to anticipate were coming. The result was that the 2-pounder was already struggling within a few years of its entry into service and was effectively obsolete within a decade. It had no margin to give when the threat evolved. The 17-pounder had margin, lots of it. And that margin, extended by the APD's ammunition development that the gun's caliber permitted, is the technical foundation of the gun's extraordinary longevity. There is something else worth noting about the British approach to the 17-pounder that speaks to a broader characteristic of British military engineering in this period. Britain in the 1930s and 1940s was not the wealthiest or most industrially capable nation fighting in the war. It was outproduced by the United States in nearly every category of military equipment. It didn't have the resources to simply build vast numbers of average weapons and overwhelm the problem through quantity. It needed to be smarter about quality. It needed weapons that punched